Please go to EliTheComputerGuy.com in order to view schematics, code, and more for the projects that you are learning about. Welcome back. So in today's video, I'm going to tell you the best Linux distribution. And if you follow me for any length of time, you know what that really means is I'm not going to spoon feed this crap to you. I'm going to explain some concepts, some things that you have to think about, and then I'm going to let you go out there and figure out what the hell it is that you want to do. So today what we're going to do is I'm going to explain some of the things that you really need to think about when you're going out there to choose a Linux distribution, especially if you're going to put it into a production environment. Now this is a very important thing to think about. Now, you know, when we talk about production environments, a lot of times people think about hundreds of servers or thousands of servers or whatever the backbone of your infrastructure is going to be. But the reality is, you know, a production environment can be a pretty small environment. This could simply be a server in order to run your work order system, maybe a server in order to run some kind of, you know, email notification system, things like that. And what happens a lot of times is people build those kind of boxes, they build those kinds of servers because it's kind of like a one-off thing, right? Oh, I'm a little bored, you know, I don't have anything better to do, so I'll spin up this box, I'll set up this service, and hey, this will make our life a little bit better. The problem is, 8 years later, when that box is still running, and now instead of having 1 user connected to it or 10 users connected to it, you now have 1,000 users connected to it. Basically, the decisions you make way back when you're just a little bit bored and you want to set up this box, really will have an impact much later on. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the things that you need to think about when choosing the best distribution for your environment and your situation so that you don't end up having a complete mess later. Now, the first thing that you need to think about when you're going to be choosing the best Linux distribution for you is to remember that with Linux, let's be honest here, let's be honest, as one old-time IT guy to whoever the hell you are, let's be honest. All Linux is pretty much kind of sort of the same, right? You got the same Linux kernel. You can use the same shells, most of the same shells, no matter what Linux distribution you're using. If you're using Apache on CentOS, it's basically the same as using Apache on Ubuntu. The reality is all these thousands of distributions really kind of sort of, at the end of the day, work the same. But the problem becomes in the details. And so this is an important thing to be thinking about as a technology professional, right? So when you're sitting down and you're thinking about what operating system that you're going to use for your infrastructure, and you have, you know, Windows versus Mac versus Linux, there are huge differences there. There's huge differences between those operating systems. There's huge differences between those ecosystems. And so it can be really easy, honestly, to choose one over the other. It's like, okay, well, I know we have an Active Directory infrastructure. I have a big budget, so I'm just going to use Windows. Or, hey, we don't have an Active Directory infrastructure, so I don't care about that type of thing. We have a smaller budget. We really care about open source, so we're going to go Linux. Hey, we have a stupid amount of money and we just want to throw it at the wall, so let's buy Mac, right? You know, when you're thinking about the core operating systems, again, whether you're talking about Windows or Mac or Linux, when you're choosing between those, that decision can actually be very simple. The problem you get into is once you choose Linux, right, you have 1,000 different distributions of Linux, but all those distributions of Linux are very, 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 very similar. And so you can get caught up by basically thinking that they're all exactly the same, just choosing one willy-nilly. And then again, when you're building out your project, or maybe 4 or 5 years from now, you can run into problems because of these smaller things that you weren't thinking about originally, and they come and basically bite you in the butt in the future. So when you're going to be thinking about deploying a Linux distribution for your environment, you really need to be thinking about the small things, not just the big things, not just, you know, oh, I like the shell, or oh, I like the logo. Let's be honest. That's why most people choose a distribution distribution. I like hats. I'm going to go with Red Hat, right? You know, instead of thinking about that, you got to look at the smaller things. You got to look at your environment, and you really have to think about what you're doing, what problems you're trying to solve, what resources you have, and where you think your organization and your department are going. If you think about those things, you'll have less problems in the future supporting the distributions that you deploy, and life is going to be a lot easier for you. So the first thing that you're going to have to be thinking about when you're looking at whatever distribution that you're going to use for your environment or the environment that you think that you're going to be going into is simply to ask what the software requirements are. Now, it is kind of weird in the Linux world, but there is some software that will only run on specific distributions of Linux. A lot of this has to do with the Red Hat world. So Red Hat is, you know, one of the big 800-pound gorillas in the Linux world. And so they have some software that more or less will only run on Red Hat. So one of the things that you have to be thinking about is you have to be thinking about, you know, what is it that your clients, your users need, what software, what products are they going to be using to solve those problems, and then simply asking, you know, what can I install that on? A lot of times what you'll find is that the particular packages that you're using, they will only run on specific distributions, or they will only be supported on specific distributions. And so at the end of the day, it becomes very simple that, oh, okay, we're running this, therefore we're going to be using this distribution. That's all there really is to say. So the first thing that you're going to have to be looking at is what are your specific software requirements. The next thing that you have to think about is what are your support requirements? Now, the first thing, as I alluded to before, the first thing you have to be thinking about with support requirements is that if you purchase or license software that is going to be running on your Linux servers, many times the vendors that support those products will only support specific distributions. Now, to be clear, this isn't necessarily a technical thing, right? And again, this is one thing you have to think about in the real corporate business world is sometimes these companies say, we will only support, you know, Ubuntu or Red Hat or something like that. And then you get the hackers, you get the kids out there, and they get whatever product that is to work on a different distribution of Linux. And then basically those people say, well, yeah, these companies are just trying to force you to use X, Y, or Z distribution. You can do whatever you want. Well, what a lot of people don't realize is that many times the software will run on other distributions just fine. But when you go for support, right? Imagine you're in a large organization. Again, you have something like a ticketing system or a notification system. You have some kind of specialized system that are running on your Linux boxes, right? Now, most of the time, they're going to do whatever the hell they're going to do. You're going to set it up, you're going to install it, and they're going to do, right? That's a great thing with Linux. They're just going to keep doing that, right? Every once in a while, maybe you run into an issue. You know, you have to create a folder, or you have to do some basic troubleshooting, some basic maintenance, and so you go there and do it. But then every once in a while, you may get some real nasty quirk. Basically, in your environment, with your networking, with the firewall, with 1,000 other things going on, that little box that your company depends on, I haven't really thought about it too much, all of a sudden simply does not work. Again, maybe something like an undocumented port. So maybe you install a new firewall, you think you know all the ports that have to be opened, you open up all the ports, and for some reason this box is failing, and what you don't realize is there's an undocumented port that it needs in order to do the communication. Maybe you have some kind of other issues. So where that whole idea of supported distribution comes from is you're then going to call up the vendor, most likely you're going to have a support contract, and you're going to go, right? Because the big thing to understand in the tech world is you're not going to know everything. You know, the senior level MCSE is not going to know everything. The senior level network engineer is not going to know everything. You're going to know a lot, but there are going to be some of these specific products that you know, there's something goes wrong with it, right? So you call for support. You say, hey, help, you know, the thing's not working. I need you to SSH into it or whatever else and fix the damn thing, right? And you will pay that company for a support contract so that they can do it. Well, remember, they have to think about actually providing the support services for these products. And so again, making sure that technicians are up to speed on specific operating systems and everything else that requires time, energy, expertise. And so one of the things that the vendors do is they say, okay, what we're going to say is that we will support our product on, I don't know, Red Hat and Ubuntu. Because when somebody calls for support, then they can make sure their technicians are experts at their product running on Ubuntu and Red Hat. So if you call, you've got that operating system or that distribution with their product, then they know everything that's going on. Again, they know the commands, they know the file locations, they know how everything should work. Whereas, again, if you have like FreeBSD or if you're using some other distribution, the fact of the matter is that when they try to fix the product or figure out what's going on, they may not know what's going on specifically with that distribution, and therefore they don't want to support it. So one of the first things you need to think about is the support requirements, as in when you purchase an application to install on one of these servers, you purchase the support contract. The fact of the matter is a lot of times they are going to dictate what distributions that they are willing to support, and so you're going to be stuck with that. The next thing that you need to be thinking about with support requirements is the question of, is your company going to be purchasing maintenance contracts or support agreements for these Linux machines? Again, when you have a company, not all the technicians in the company can be experts on everything. And so what a lot of times what companies like to do is they buy support contracts from companies, again, such as Red Hat, so that if a server crashes, then they know that they have somebody to go to, right? Basically, we pay this $350 a year to guarantee that if this Linux server crashes, we can call somebody over at Red Hat and they will try to help us fix this. And so this is something that you need to be thinking about with your company. So with your company may be small, and so again, support contracts can be expensive. So you may have a small company with a rather simple infrastructure, simple system, so they don't care about support contracts. So they don't care whether you use Ubuntu or CentOS or Red Hat. You're going to fix it. If it breaks, you're going to fix it. But if you're in larger companies, or if your company is growing, something to really think about is, hey, can I buy a service contract or a support contract for these operating systems? So if I've got 20 Linux machines all doing what the hell they're supposed to do, and something breaks, something fails, do I have somebody to call that will then try to help me out? And so that's something you need to be thinking about with the distributions is, are service contracts, are support contracts important to you? Is this something that's valuable? And if it is, then you need to look at distributions such as Red Hat that offer those support contract services. The next thing that you need to think about is, what is the institutional knowledge of Linux within your organization? So what we talk about with institutional knowledge is what do people within your tech organization already understand, right? And this is one of those weird ones. Again, in the tech world, this is a weird one where you may go out there and you say, okay, we're looking at deploying Linux into our environment. What distribution of Linux does everybody know? And then everybody raises, you got 5 or 6 people raise their hand and they go, we know SUSE Linux. You're like, why the hell do you know SUSE Linux? But for whatever reason, they focused on SUSE Linux or Mandrake Linux or CentOS or whatever else, right? So one of the things you have to be thinking about is when you deploy these server boxes, these Linux boxes into your infrastructure, they are going to have to be supported not just by you, but importantly by other people. This is an important thing you have to think about in the technology world. Is in the technology world, people really get this whole idea of army of one. Right? I know how this box works, and so I will fix this box. Well, what happens if you get sick? Or what happens if you get tired? Or what happens if you get fired? Well, if you get fired, you probably don't care, right? The fact of the matter is, what happens if the box crashes when you're not around, right? Then somebody else, another technician, is going to have to sit down and figure out what's going on. The smaller the learning curve that they have, the better it's going to be for everybody, right? So let's say you have a custom application or a specific application that's running on a Linux box. And so the person sits down and it's Ubuntu or CentOS, right? But they already know how that distribution works. They already know the commands, they already know the file structure, they already know that they can just sit there and tippy tap, type tap and figure out what's going on, right? Then life is going to be pretty easy, right? They may call you up and say, hey, this you know, the box failed, you know, do you have any idea what might happen? You're like, oh yeah, you need to restart X, Y, or Z services. They already know how to deal with that distribution, so they go, okay, they restart X, Y, or Z services, and life goes on, right? That's pretty easy, right? You had a problem, the person was able to sit down, they were able to troubleshoot it, they were able to go on. Here's the problem, right? What happens again, like if everybody in your organization, they have the institutional knowledge for Ubuntu, right? So they've been hyper-focused on Ubuntu, and then you deploy a CentOS box. Now, it is still Linux. A lot of things are similar, but some things are different. So when they sit down, they're gonna go, oh, it's Linux. This is gonna be no big deal. And they're gonna tippy-tap type. Crap. Why didn't that work? Tippy-tap type. Crap, why didn't that work? Oh, crap, this is a CentOS box, isn't it? Oh, does anybody here remember? Does anybody use a CentOS? No, right? And they're going to have to go through there, and they're going to figure out the specific things, and they're going to have to do extra Google searching, and then they're going to have to make sure that when they're doing troubleshooting, is the box making a mistake, or did they type a command in improperly? That's the kind of stupidity that you can run into. And so one of the things to look at when you're going to be learning Linux is just what is the institutional knowledge? What distributions is your company already using, right? If your company is already using Red Hat or CentOS, or they're already using Ubuntu, the fact of the matter is just learn that. That is what they're already using. That's what people can help you with. They already know what's going on. You can communicate back and forth. If a box you build has a problem, somebody else can work on it rather easily. And so, you know, with a lot of these things, it's just go with the flow. If there's not a major reason to make a major course correction, again, you're just doing it just to set up boxes, then just do what everybody else does and already knows, and go from there. Now, a big thing when you're thinking about these distributions, and again, you're thinking about things like service and maintenance contracts, you're thinking about institutional knowledge. I know that doesn't sound cool. That doesn't sound cool. Eli, that's not cool. Eli, I'm in this for the passion. I'm in this for the cool. I don't want to deploy the same distribution we've deployed 10,000 times. If they deploy a distribution 10,000 times, I'm going to find an entirely different distribution to deploy just because, you know, I really care about tech. I'm not like you, Eli. I'm not old and burnt out, right? I care about tech. I'm going to use every single distribution I can possibly get my hands on. Well, the problem is that's horrible for a company. That is horrible for a company. If it's horrible for a company, it's probably not too good for your career. Because one of the things that you have to be thinking about, again, when you're deploying these distributions in the real world, is something called the total cost of ownership. Total cost of ownership is one of the major reasons that large organizations still go with Microsoft Windows Server versus Linux, even though Windows Server, you have to pay $600 to, I don't know, $3,000 for the server license, and then you have to pay like $50 or more per client access license. Plus, you know, Bill Gates just comes over every once in a while and raids your fridge, right? There's a reason why people still use Windows over Linux, even though Linux is free. Well, you'd have to be a moron. You'd have to be a moron to pay all this money and let Bill Gates raid your refrigerator whenever he wants when you can use Linux for free. Well, the reason for this is something called total cost of ownership. So when I deploy a server into my environment, I am not simply looking at the cost of the individual license. I am looking at the overall cost, everything it will cost me and my organizations to keep that box up and running for the life expectancy of that box. So if that box is going to be up for 5 years, I am not simply looking at the $600 and $50 cows and all that kind of thing. I am looking at things like, what are support contracts going to cost? How much do technicians cost who know this particular operating system? If I have to call in a consultant, is the consultant going to be, you know, can I get a pretty generic consultant that's going to cost me $100 an hour? Or if I call somebody in, is it going to cost me $300 or $400 an hour, right? These are things that you have to be thinking about. You know, that's a big thing with the service contracts, is if you look at like Red Hat. I was just doing a basic search, and it seems like the standard service contract for Red Hat is $350 per year. So $350 per it seems, per server that you have running. And a lot of people, that's ridiculous. Why would I ever spend $350 per year for a maintenance contract for a Linux server that's free? Well, the reason is because if you have to call in a consultant because that Linux server crashed, it may cost you $150 an hour for them to try to get that thing back up and running. And remember, in the consulting world, good and bad, guaranteed results are not guaranteed. Oh yeah, I'll take that $1,500 from you, and yeah, if it breaks tomorrow, I'll just take another $1,500 from you, right? So by paying $350 a year, it's kind of like health insurance, kind of like insurance, where you pay it. If you don't need it, then it seems like a waste. But if you do need it, you're not paying somebody $150 an hour in order to keep the thing up and running. And again, that's the type of thing that you need to be thinking about with the distributions where, are you going to go with command line or are you going to go with GUI? And, you have to think about, the technicians that are going to be using these servers and maintaining these servers. It's all well and good. It's all well and good to get all high-minded. I would never use a GUI on Linux. Well, here's the thing, right? If I have a $15 an hour employee that's responsible for that file server, or print server, or web server, or something like that, right? I would feel relatively comfortable with a low-level, couple-year technician working on a GUI-based web server or file server or something like that. Most likely they'll be able to handle it. On the other hand, if all there is a command line, right, that might be a real issue. So now instead of being able to pay that $15, $20 an hour technician, you got to be paying a $50 an hour technician in order to figure out what's going on. So one of the big things to be thinking about with the distribution of Linux that you're going to be using is what is the total cost of ownership. And again, if you're not there, I know you're the smartest person in the world, but what happens if you're sick? What happens if you have the flu that day? If you have the flu and that box crashes, how much will it cost the company to get that box up and running? Is that something that your assistant can simply walk over, see what's going on, and get it back up and running? So essentially it doesn't cost the company anything at all. Is that something where your assistant can call the support services and say, hey, our box crashed, can you SSH into it, figure out what's going on? That costs you $350 a year. Or is that something where there's no support, your assistant doesn't know what the hell to do with this thing, so you're calling in a $200 an hour technician to more or less reboot the thing? So you've really got to be thinking about total cost of ownership when you're looking at which distribution of Linux you're going to put into your environment, because this can make a huge difference. And again, this is a big thing why a lot of people laugh and they get all snotty and snarky about why do organizations still use Windows when they could use Linux. And if you actually read the white papers, if you actually look at the business people talk about it, many, 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 many times, paying that license fee, paying for the client access licenses, paying for all of that, the total cost of ownership is so much less. I mean, just exponentially less than running Linux because of all these other things. Again, most of the tech industry already understands how to use Windows. So many people in the tech industry already have their MCSEs. There is just a huge amount of documentation and support services out there. And so the fact of the matter is that these companies realize, oh, Windows on a total cost of ownership basis ends up being less expensive than the free Linux. And so this is one of the things you have to be thinking about with the Linux distributions, whether you go with command line, whether you go with shells. Which shell do you use? Do you just use GNOME? Do you use KDE? What do people feel comfortable with? This is really going to matter for you and your organization. And now the final thing to think about with whatever distribution you're going to decide to go with is just basically, what do you like? What calls to you? When you look at a logo or a distribution, what calls your name? What says your name? Because in reality, that's a lot of of why people go with one version of Linux over the other. Again, the kernel's more or less the same. Shells are more or less the same. Most of the services that you're going to be using are more or less the same. Again, once you get out of support and special products and all that, it's more or less the same. It's 1,000. I think of Linux kind of like pants, right? You know, you have Carhartt pants, and you have North Face pants, and you have Levi's. And now in reality, you know, if you're going to a construction site, it's probably better to wear Carhartts versus North Face. And if you're going to go hiking up a mountain, it's probably better to hike up a mountain in North Face versus Carhartts. But at the end of the day, you can hike up a mountain in Carhartts, and you can go to a construction site in North Face. It doesn't really matter. It's kind of like that. Like when you really think about Linux distributions, it's like pants. You know, the difference between Levi's and Lucky's and Carhartts. Why you choose one or the other? Oh, you'll come up with reasons. Everybody does. Everybody. Well, the reason that I wear these pants are right. You know, but the fact of the matter is, a lot of times it's just like, I like, I like that. You like the look and feel. You like the color freaking scheme, right? Those kinds of things may be things that draw you. So after you've thought about things like the support services, after you've thought about things like required distributions, after you've thought about total cost of ownership and institutional knowledge, a lot of it's simply going to come down to what do you like? Again, and it really, so many times, it's just you look down at the pants you're wearing, and you wear those pants because, and that's why a lot of people choose their distributions. They'll come up with very long-winded reasons on why their distributions are the best distributions to use. But basically, what they're really telling you is why their pants are the best pants, right? If you kind of get my drift. So that's just one thing to be thinking about too. Again, if you're sitting there, you're looking at these different distributions, you've thought about these other things, you've got a couple in front of you that you can use. You know, maybe it comes down to look and feel. Maybe Fedora. Maybe it's like, ooh, I like Fedora. You know, you boot up Fedora and you're like, oh, I like that. I like the blue. I like the kind of like that dark, bold thing going on. Or you boot up Ubuntu and it's got that little orangey thing. You're like, oh, I kind of like the orangey thing. I don't know, Susie's got their weird ass lizard. I think Mandrake's got a penguin, which makes sense, right? You know, that's really what it comes down to sometimes. So that's fine. Again, that's fine. There's no problem with that. And so some of the time it really does just come down to the look and feel. Now, one of the big warnings that I'll give you as somebody that's been around for a little while is whatever the hell you pick, try to be as consistent as possible. As I was talking about before, if you're going to be deploying web servers, if you're going to be deploying Linux servers in your environment, if there is not a reason to go with a different distribution, just use the same darn distribution everybody else is using. Because again, from an institutional knowledge, people being able to work with that distribution, feel comfortable with it. From a documentation knowledge, basically documenting what, you know, why this server is different than this server. For a lot of different reasons, it is very useful to simply stay consistent. And that's also important if you go off to the Red Hat world. So the Red Hat world is kind of its own little weird world. It's got support services and all that. One of the things to be thinking about if you go into the Red Hat world is maybe you want to spin up servers where you don't need those support contracts, right? So again, you know, if you're doing, I don't know, clustering, if you're doing something very sophisticated, you most likely want to buy support services from Red Hat just in case anything goes horribly wrong, you have somebody to call. But the reality is you're probably going to have, you know, web servers that you're fine. You don't need support services on, or print servers or file servers, you know, these basic crappy servers that have been around for 30 years. And so they're fine. Any problem that they're going to have, you're going to be able to fix. So you don't want support services on those. So something to think about is instead of going to Ubuntu, right? So Ubuntu is an entirely different fork than Red Hat. One of the things to think about is just going with CentOS. So CentOS is the free kind of sort of version of Red Hat. Basically everything works the same way. It's within the same fork. So you can have your primary infrastructure with support services with Red Hat, and then you can have the secondary infrastructure with all these kind of like run-of-the-mill servers that you don't need support services for. But the important thing is that all of your technicians will be able to go rather seamlessly between the two. If they're sitting down at a Red Hat machine, they know what commands to put in, they know what's going on. If they sit down at a CentOS machine, it's basically the same thing. They know everything that's going on, and they won't have to have a learning curve. They won't have to have a problem. So really think about keeping everything as consistent as possible across your infrastructure. At the end of the day, it'll make your life a hell of a lot easier. Yeah, your job's not going to be as exciting. It's not going to be as exciting. The fireworks aren't going to be going off. There's not going to be emergencies and everybody running around screaming for their lives. And that's a good thing. That's good. Remember, as technicians, the quieter and more boring your environment is, that's winning. That's winning. If your environment is completely quiet and it is so boring, you're sitting there just banging your head against the wall just to get some kind of stimulation, that means you're doing things right. That means you're doing things right. So try to keep consistency across all the things that you're doing. It'll make your life a hell of a lot easier at the end of the day. So to wrap this up, I figured I'd give you an example of why we're going to be using Ubuntu as the base distribution for the introduction class when I actually start teaching you the technical things on how to work with Linux. And for me, the reason that I'm going with Ubuntu is a couple of fold. The first reason is because it's the most popular Linux distribution out there. So it's been the most popular for a long time. And again, for me, my personal thing, especially when I'm doing education, is I always like betting on the winning horse. Why would I bet on any horse other than the one that's already winning? It's just kind of my thing. Like, I look for the companies that are already in the first position. And again, unless there's a specific reason not to use that company, I will just go with them because it's more likely that everybody else, more people will understand that particular company or that particular product. More people will be comfortable with it. There will be more support for it, the whole 9 yards. So one of the reasons that we'll be using Ubuntu going forward is simply because it's already, the most used distribution out there, and so there's already a huge knowledge base for Ubuntu, and people feel comfortable with it. The other thing with Ubuntu, one of the things I like about Ubuntu, is that there's a lot of different versions of Ubuntu out there, and so it'll make it easier for me when I'm trying to educate students on additional projects going into the future. So I just finished up doing about 50 videos on Arduino. And so one of the things that I want to do is I want to continue doing a series of IoT videos going into the future using Raspberry Pi and other things. And so when I was doing the research on Raspberry Pi, one of the things that I saw is that you can actually have Ubuntu running on Raspberry Pi. Now again, for me, I like to keep the learning curve as small as possible. So the way that I look at it is I can teach you Ubuntu from the basic standpoint. And then when we go to teach you Raspberry Pi going into the IoT world, we're still going to be using the Ubuntu operating system on Raspberry Pi. So when I'm teaching you Raspberry Pi, you're not going to have to learn a different Linux operating system, a different Linux distribution with different things. You're already comfortable with Ubuntu, so we're going to simply be taking Ubuntu to Raspberry Pi, and now we're going to be using Ubuntu on Raspberry Pi in order to trigger different pins and different events to happen. So the learning curve for Raspberry Pi should be a lot shallower than if I have to start with teaching you I think it's the Raspberry and Linux distribution, teach you the specifics of that, and go from there. So that's one of the reasons that we'll be using Ubuntu is I think from an educational standpoint, it's already so widely distributed. It's already on so many different types of products. It'll make life easier for me and easier for you, where I can just teach you Ubuntu here, and then we take your knowledge from here, and then we can transfer that when we're dealing with a Raspberry Pi, and then we can take the knowledge from that to when we go to the cloud. And so then I can be teaching you other types. Instead of teaching you file and folder structure for the 50th frickin' time, right? This is how files and folders are structured on this distribution. And this is how files and folders are structured on this distribution. Instead of going over that however many times, I can say, it's Ubuntu. You already know all that. let's get to the new cool stuff, right? And so again, and that's an important thing to be thinking about in the tech world is do you really want to be reinventing the wheel? Do you really want to have to be relearning how to install an application from a repository or file and folder structure? Or do you want to use an operating system or distribution? You already know how that works. And now you can focus on the new cool stuff instead. So, I'm sure for a lot of noobs out there, I just made all of that about as clear as mud. I'm sure some of you folks are like, wow, that answered nothing. You came to me. You came to me. You came to watch my video. This is the kind of information you get out of me sometimes, right? I'm sure there's a perfect distribution out there for you. I just really can't tell you what it is. Again, there's a lot of these things that you have to think about, and too many people don't think about it. You've got 10 different distributions in an environment. It turns into a colossal mess, and then, whatever. So these are some of the things that you need to be thinking about. I would argue at the end of the day, if you really don't know what distribution of Linux to go for, I argue, my personal opinion, I would go with desktop Ubuntu. Ubuntu is the major player. I think they've got like 60% market share. They've got a huge market share in the Linux world. Plus, again, they have all these things, again, for Raspberry Pi. They have a lot of places where you can use Ubuntu in different areas. If you use the desktop version, it's very simple. You've got a nice graphical user interface, so on and so forth. And so I would just argue, start with Ubuntu, because you're going to get a lot of people out there. Some people are going to tell you this, and some people are going to tell you that, and some people are going to tell you the other thing. And then again, people get frustrated and confused. I would argue, start with Ubuntu, learn Ubuntu, feel comfortable, be able to build a LAMP server, be able to build a Samba server, be able to build some of these other servers, get comfortable with Ubuntu. And then if you find, for whatever reason, you don't like the color scheme or whatever else, then you can go and look for a different distribution. One of the big problems that I see with new people when they're trying to figure out what distribution to use is they never really learn Linux that well to begin with. And so they learn a couple of things on Ubuntu, and then they go and they try to use something else. And then they get frustrated because what they learned on Ubuntu doesn't work on that other thing. And then they go somewhere else and they get frustrated, and then they get frustrated, and then they get frustrated. And then at the end of the day, they just give up. And at the point you give up, the game's over. So I would say, sit down with Ubuntu. If you don't know anything else, sit down with Ubuntu, figure it out, get comfortable building a server, get comfortable working with it, and then after that point, you can go out there and start working with other distributions, and you'll probably be better for it. So with that, as always, I enjoyed doing this video, and look forward to seeing you on the next one.